Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a Boeing 737 pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. In today's video we will talk a little bit about the cost index, what it is, how it's calculated, and I will also tell you a little bit of advice of my personal experience with cost index and changing around airspeeds. And finally I will show you a great database of where you can find cost indexes used by different airlines. The main sources I'm using for this video, next to general pilot training and knowledge, are a Boeing document called Fuel Conservation Strategies, Cost Index Explained, and the Cost Index database from Toga project, which has been mainly worked on between 2016 and 2019, both of which I will link in the video description below in case you want to read up on the original documents. So generally, the cost index is the equation time cost in dollars per hour divided by fuel cost in cents per pound. Note that some different manufacturers may be using different units here, but in general it is time cost divided by fuel cost. The pilot will generally enter the cost index into the flight management computer, and together with the remaining performance data such as the weight, the winds, etc., the FMC is then going to calculate the most economical climb, cruise and descent speeds. What can be said in general is that for all models, entering 0 as cost index results in the maximum range airspeed and minimum trip fuel, while conversely entering the highest cost index is going to give you a minimum trip time, so a cruise at the maximum speeds possible in the airplane. Generally, variable fuel prices, fuel tankering and fuel hedging make the cost index calculation complicated, so things aren't as easy, but we'll get over that in the rest of the video. So, in general, ranges of allowable cost indexes for Boeing airplane are usually between 0 to 999 or 0 to 9999. At least for the 747, 57, 67 and 777, while of course in the 737 things had to be made a little bit more complicated. So in the 737 Classic we're looking at a range of 0 to 200, and in the 737 NGs we're looking at 0 to 500. In practical cases, none of the extreme values are usually used by operators. For sure you will find some operating at very low cost indexes, such as cost index 2 for example for Sun Express, and you will surely also find some examples of airline operating at the highest possible cost index. That is generally the case when airlines are flying delayed. So, resulting from the explanation or from the basic formula that we came up with earlier in this video, you will see that clearly a low cost index should be used when fuel costs are high compared to other operating costs, and vice versa. If fuel costs are low and your operating cost is really high, then you would fly with a very high cost index. Now, in general, the FMC is going to calculate the climb, cruise and descent speeds from the entered cost index. However, especially to comply with air traffic control requirements, the airspeed used during descent tends to be the most restricted of the three flight phases, and therefore it could be procedure in an airline that a general descent speed is entered and only climb and cruise are flown on the actual econ speed from the cost index. You do have to note here that when flying at a cost index of 0, the climb is in general calculated for minimum fuel, the cruise for maximum range, and the descent for the maximum lift to drag ratio. When entering the maximum cost index, normally on all three phases of flight, the FMC is just going to go to VMO or MMO, so the maximum airspeeds possible. Do note that when we say that for the cost index 0, minimum fuel in the climb, does not mean that it is going to be actually the least fuel consumption. However, it is going to be the minimum contribution of the fuel used up in the climb to the total trip fuel, which is different from the minimum amount of fuel that you could use to reach your cruising altitude. So let's have a look at some typical numbers resulting from different cost indexes. Now, I'm going to do this one for a Boeing 757, since I have original Boeing numbers here in the Boeing document, and I want to stay as close as possible to it to eliminate any possible, let's call it, misconceptions that pilots might get, because there is a large influence of the speed that you are going to get from the cost index depending on the wind. So you might fly two seemingly identical flights at the same weight, the same cost index, the same route and everything, and you might get totally different speeds as a result of the wind being totally different. So bear that in mind. So for a typical flight in a Boeing 757 at cost index 0, we're looking at a climb speed of around 290 knots and on conversion Mach 0.778. For cruise it's going to maintain that Mach number, and in the descent it's going to go 250 knots. If we use the highest possible cost index of 9,999, it's going to climb at 345 knots and on conversion Mach 0.847. It's going to maintain that Mach number in the cruise, and then in descent it's going to reduce to Mach 0.819 and 334 knots on conversion. And now, if we have a look at some typical cost indexes used on Boeing 757s of around 70, then we end up with speeds of 312 knots and Mach 0.794, and in the descent Mach 0.8 and on conversion 313 knots. So what we can see here is that in climb and cruise, a typical cost index is normally giving you a speed closer to the cost index 0 than the maximum cost index, while in the descent it can actually have a great influence if you just have a slight increase in your cost index. What is going to be most noticeable, however, is that the resulting optimum and maximum altitudes are also going to have a significant change depending on the cost index entered. So let's have a look at the previous example again. If we would fly our 757 with a cost index of 0 under the given circumstances, then we would get a recommended altitude of an optimum 328, maximum 362, so flight level 362, and a recommended from the FMC of flight level 310. Now if we had the very same flight with a cost index of 999, our optimum would be just flight level 268 with a maximum of also 268 and recommended of level 260. Now you may wonder, why is the optimum or maximum altitude actually lower than with a higher cost index? And that is rather simple, because the airplane may be thrust limited or it may be buffet limited at high altitudes. And in this particular case, our Boeing 757 would have to fly at a much lower altitude in order to be able to fly these airspeeds. Also note that the true airspeed is higher at flight levels around level 300 than at, for example, flight level 400. So in general, if you do want to go faster, anywhere around level 300 you're going to get the highest true airspeed out of a given Mach number. Now, things aren't quite that easy, however. Let's have a look at the typical operating ranges of cost indexes. In our 757 example, Boeing uses the number 70. Now, since this is a 737 based channel, I'll bring in some practical experience here. So for 737's typical cost index are in the region between 10 and 30. And to illustrate the same with the Boeing example, however, we'll use cost index 70 as a typical example here. And remember, from cost index 0, we had an optimum altitude of flight level 328. From the highest cost index, 9,999, we're getting level 268. And with cost index 70 over here, so our typical index, we get an optimum of flight level 327 once again. So just about in the region of the cost index 0. And the recommended level in that situation is 310. So round about the same again as the least cost index. Now why is that? That is because in a typical cruise situation, we're looking at rather constant operating cost, which has stabilized a lot over the last many years. While, however, with fuel prices, things have been quite different, and they actually went up quite a bit over the past long years. And that is not even taking the current events into account. So that usually gives us typical cost indexes that are in the lower regions, to put it that way. Now, let's actually have a look at an analysis that Boeing has done for a particular non-named operator of the impact both in trip time and annual cost savings by adjusting the cost index. The named operator was using a cost index of 45 on the Boeing 737-700 and on the 737-400 cost index 30. Boeing made some analysis and came to the conclusion that the optimum cost index for that airline would be 12 in both cases. Now, they've given some examples here between the difference between cost index that was currently used and the optimum. So cost index 30 for the 737-400 and 45 for the 700, compared to cost index 12, and they took an average flight length of 1,000 nautical miles as an example. If the said airline would adjust its cost index on the 737-400 from 30 to 12, the average 1,000 mile flight would just take a single minute longer, and the annual cost saving would be in the region of approximately $771,000 US for a single more minute flight time. Now let's have a look at the 737-700, where the current cost index of that operator was 45, and the optimum cost index would have been 12. The average flight time on a 1,000 nautical mile flight would be increased by 3 minutes. However, the annual cost savings were in the region of almost $2 million US per airplane. And that is a huge impact. The resulting impact on your commercial schedule is almost nothing. As you saw, we are talking the region of about 1 to 3 minutes here, while the cost saving is in the 6 digits, if not in the 7 digits. Alright, so one factor that comes into conclusion, or the calculation of the cost index, is the time cost, and the other one is the fuel cost. For time cost, the numerator in the cost index equation is often called time relation or time-related direct operating cost, and that includes items such as flight crew wages or maintenance cost and fixed costs, maybe even with no variation on the flying time. So Boeing gives examples here such as engines, APUs, and airplanes that could either be leased by the hour or maybe owned, and maintenance cost can be accounted for on airplanes by the hour, by the calendar, or by flight cycles. So all of these make quite a variation in the time cost that an operator is going to incur. Now, why is that important? Well, that's quite easy, because for pilots it is quite easy to understand minimizing fuel consumption. However, minimizing fuel consumption is not quite everything here, because the time-related cost is a lot more difficult to understand than the fuel cost. Now, looking at the fuel cost, things aren't quite as easy. Of course, it might be easy to have a look and say, alright, the fuel prices are rising so and so much, so I want to save my airline some money by flying a little bit closer and choosing cost index 0. Now, that's not how it works. First of all, fuel prices are highly variable on the market, and they can be influenced by the location where you are, by doing fuel tankering, and even by fuel hedging. Now, those of you who don't know what fuel hedging is, that would be a topic for a whole different video, so just go and Google it. But it basically, in very easily terms, means as much as saving some fuel by saving or by buying a certain amount of fuel for a fixed price in advance. So that's something that hit a lot of airlines during the COVID crisis, where they went ahead and they had purchased the fuel for an entire year already the previous year for a fixed price. And then when COVID came and the amount of flights deteriorated so much, the airlines had nonetheless bought the fuel, and now it's their problem what to do with it. So you can see we have two variables here, and it is not always that easy for pilots to understand how the optimal cost is actually made up, and that's why it's so important for you pilots. If you're just flying along on a normal schedule, just stick to the cost index that your airline has calculated, and there is absolutely no sense in thinking you can do better than your airline's operation department can. Normally, Boeing is working very closely with the airlines to calculate the most optimal cost index for their kind of operation, and then it is up to the airline to determine philosophies of how to turn that into cost indexes and into instructions on when to increase or when to decrease speeds. Now, this is the document from which most of the information that you've heard so far in this video came. And as I told you earlier on, it is going to be linked in the video description below. Let's quickly have a look at another document that I want to show you, and that is this. This is from Toga Projects called Cost Index Database, and once again I'm linking to that in the video description below. And this gives a very good overview on different cost indexes used by different airlines. It is not always 100% accurate, however it does provide a very good guidance. So up here we have an overview on different airlines and which cost indexes they are using. So let's have a look at some for the Boeing 737. We'll just start with A, and the first operator I tend to see here is going to be Aerolíneas Argentinas, using a cost index of 25. Aeromexico, you can see, is also cost index 30, and then we're going on. Air Berlin, 737NG, cost index 8, and Air Malta, cost index 25. Now, we can go over this and we can go over a lot of different fleets, but the general outcome is going to be that we are going to get cost indexes of roughly 30 or less for most airlines. So, of course, there is always that very prominent example that many of you mates from Europe are aware of, being Ryanair, flying at a cost index of 6. Now, we saw earlier up that there is actually not too much of a difference by adjusting the actual cost index. So let's talk a little bit about experience here and about how things might be changing. In the operation that my airline does, we're operating a cost index round about 10. And in general, our flights are in the region of approximately an hour and 20. With a lot of flights in the region of approximately 2 hours as well. Now, if we're running really late on schedule, then we can contact our operations department and they will evaluate if it would make sense for us to get a cost index 100 flight plan. So, how big is that change actually going to be then on our actual flight? Let's take the average flight of approximately 1 hour and 20. If we change from cost index of around about 10 to cost index of 100, then we would be using typically around 200 to 300 kilograms more fuel, and it would give us a time saving in the region of approximately 8 minutes. You can actually find out the amount of time that you may be able to save by looking at the RTA page on the FMC. So that's from the progress page. You go on to page number 3 of 4, and then you just enter the destination runway as the RTA waypoint. So, for example, when you're still standing on the ground, you and you were to fly to, let's say, London Heathrow with a landing runway planned of 27 left, then you could enter Romeo Whiskey 27 left as the RTA waypoint on the RTA page. And then on the lower left, it's going to give you the information what's the earliest time you can get there and what is the latest time you can get there. The earliest time would correspond to a cost index of 0, while the latest time would correspond to a cost index of 500. Remember, that is the highest cost index available in the Boeing 737NG. Now, my airline's flight department has said that the highest cost index we can ask for is cost index 100. And that is normally giving you speeds in the region of round about, in the climb, maybe 20 knots below VMO. Then in cruise, you're normally somewhere around Mach 0.8 with it, so you just have a very tiny margin to the top. And then in descent, it gives you something around 320 knots. So once again, a little bit of margin left, but not a lot. And now think about it this way. You're spending around, let's say, 300 kilograms more fuel for a time saving of 8 minutes. Now, is that going to be worth it? The airline's flight operation department will have to decide, but in many cases, the answer is no, that's not worth it, because you might be able to make up only so much with it, but you're using so much fuel. Keep in mind, fuel cost can easily be $1 per kilogram, so you could easily spend an additional $300 for the execution of the flight, while you would save only 8 minutes. That might be worth it when you are running close to a 3-hour delay, so if you are very short of paying compensation to the passengers, but that is pretty much the only situation, except for a night curfew where the destination airport would actually close, where it would make sense to increase your cost index. At least in my airline. Other airlines are seeing it very different. For example, if we have a look at the cost index database, then we're going to see that, for example, Norwegian, let me find them real quick. Norwegian Air Shuttle on the 737NG is using cost index 15 by default. And if they are delayed, they're going all the way up to cost index 80. Now, interestingly enough, there's a small note here saying that goes by default for all routes to Hurghada, Marsa Alam, Gran Canaria, and Tenerife. Now, you may wonder, okay, why is this? That is surely using a lot of extra fuel. And the answer is yes, it does. Now, personally, I have never actually flown such a long flight, so we're talking here from flights from Scandinavia to the Canary Islands region that are easily in the region of approximately 5.5 to 6 hours. And sure enough, that would easily cost you a ton of extra fuel. However, in this particular point, we are getting into different limitations here, which is the maximum amount of time that a flight crew is allowed to operate. And if you can shorten the flight time by, let's say, for example, 15 minutes, times 2 flights, you might be able to squeeze in a return flight for the crew without having them going to the hotel at the destination airport. So, once again, we can see here that there is a cost factor involved that we would maybe not think of in first place when thinking about cost indexes and fixed operating cost. So, in this case, using a high cost index can actually be more economical and save more money to the airline than if they have to send the pilots and the cabin crew to a hotel only to have them fly back later. In that case, they would need more pilots employed at all to fly the airplane back straight away, and they would have to pay the cost for the hotel. Alright, so this shall conclude it, and this shall conclude our overview of different cost indexes of different airlines, what a cost index is, and how it is calculated. For more information, have a look into the documents that are linked in the video description below, and as always, if you want to support the channel, hit the like button, subscribe, leave me a comment of what you think, if I missed anything, or if there is anything that I could have added. Finally, if you really want to support the channel, there is a Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below, which I'm very grateful for if you would consider a donation. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.